class, in this lecture we are going to look at the schools of thought in psychology. So basically when we say these schools of thought, or we say these ways of thought in psychology, we're really talking about these main paradigms. So there are these main paradigms under which all the theories and kind of methods and, you know, way we go about doing the experiments and stuff came about. And these are really the top main, most popular paradigms within psychology. Of course, these are not the only ones that exist. Psychology has many different subfields. Alright, so we'll just start from the beginning. So as we already know, psychology started as a science in the 19th century, and that actually began in Germany with Wilhelm Wundt. He is known as the father of psychology overall, and we note him as a father of psychology because he was one of the first guys to come along and start doing experiments on the mind-body connection, really interested in this idea of consciousness and how we go about defining that. And so he created one of the first research laboratories over in Germany, and this was one of the first places where they started to actually train students in psychological sciences, excuse me. And so Wundt, his method for observing the mind-body connection, looking into these ideas of what is consciousness, he developed this idea called objective introspective. And basically it's just examining and measuring your own thoughts and mental activity. Alright, so it's really important to make its distinction here. So with Wundt, he was interested in what was going on in our heads and how that related to our behavior. But he really wasn't putting things like instinct or emotion into it. It was very cut and dry, I guess is a way to say. It'd be like, if this is what you think, how does that relate to your physical experiment? So what he would do, he would give the students a rock, he'd ask them to pick it up, and then he would ask them how they feel, but not in the feeling emotional sense, not like in here. It's just that, how does it physically, what are those physical sensations that you're getting off the rock? Does the rock feel hot? Is the rock cold? Is the rock rough? Is the rock smooth? And then he would do that, and as he would do that, then he would kind of be like, well, what were you thinking? You know, so if you're thinking, oh, the rock's hot, what did that then trigger? That, you know, what cognitive thoughts was that triggering in your head? Okay. And the problem with this is, you know, he was looking for a way to measure and examine mental activity, but by just saying, you know, how does this make you feel? What thoughts does it make come about by holding this rock? We see that it's a little too subjective. Why? Because people are all individual, so we're going to have individual thoughts and experiences about that rock, right? So what does that mean? That means that it made his experiment hard to duplicate, so it wasn't very valid and reliable. Nonetheless, though, Wundt, you know, was very important because he created these ideas and really started to get psychology, you know, into that scientific field, which he successfully accomplished. Alright, so once Wundt came up with structuralism over in Germany, it hit the European stage, and then Wundt's student Edward Titchener, he brought structuralism to America. And so basically with structuralism, this is why, you know, we're trying to really break it down to those mental processes, is that we're breaking everything to the most simplest element. So basically we're trying to take those inner workings of our mind, our consciousness, and breaking those down into simple elements. So, you know, like we see with chemists, and they say water is composed of 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, you know, table salt is, what is it? NaO2, it's like sodium dioxide. So you know, like those chemical structures we have of thing. Titchener excuse me, and Wundt thought that you could break consciousness down to that. And so that was something more that Tincher was really interested in trying to do. And so he thought that the basic elements of the mind were experience, emotion, and thought. So we already see a little break there from Wundt, because he is bringing the idea of emotions into it. And so that's the thing about the mind-body connection. We say it kind of dualistic like that, but in reality, it's really this triad, because what else do we have? We have emotion, so that's something that we'll always have to figuring into the equation. Not all psychologists agree with that, though, as we just see. Wundt didn't, and we'll see later on that there are some others who try to think that they can't include emotions. But anyway, so that's kind of where Titchener and Wundt disagreed, and then they also kind of disagreed just about how you go about studying and measuring consciousness. So what Titcher would do with that objective introspective and that rock experiment is that then he would try to get the you to come up with the emotional aspects of it. So he would do what Wundt did, and then he would add that in. How does the rock feel? How does it make you feel? And then how does it make you feel like emotionally feel? And so he was really trying to get inside people's heads. Just a couple little facts here about Titchener. As we already said, he brought structuralism to America, which really, introduced America to the field of psychology as a science. One of his first students was one of the first women in psychology, and her name was Margaret Washburn. She got her PhD in 1894. Oh, I forgot to say this. So, structuralism began in 1897, I believe, is when Wundt started it there. And so, Washburn is really famous because she wanted to study animal consciousness, and so she was one of the early pioneers in those types of psychological experiments. And she eventually parted ways with structuralism because she kind of formulated her own motor theory of consciousness, which is really a kind of biological base because it's a motor theory, so it's really talking more about those inner workings, kind of instinctual type things there. Alright, so I say we have structuralism was the first school of thought, and it was replaced with humanism, behaviorism, and developmental psychology, and it was very instrumental in its contributions to psychology. But what really came out against structuralism there in the early 20th century, so it pretty much dominated a large part, even though, of course, it had critics and people and trying to come up with their own theories too. It kind of held it, it held at its own as the main paradigm until functionalism came along. And functionalism is another one that we kind of say started in America because we really equate William James, who is the father of American psychology, not to be confused with Wundt, who is the father of psychology overall. And James was really important because he came up with some ideas that we still use today, especially in relationship to consciousness. His biggest contribution is that idea of defining consciousness as a stream. So basically, it's just all these thoughts and images and ideas and kind of daydreams and just whatever, all that stuff that we have going on in our head. It's like a stream, and so that's all a river and all that stuff are like little twigs or little ripples that float down that. And the reason why that's important is because it kind of shows that interconnectivity of all that mental stuff that goes on, and then all those feelings, and then because all of that's connected, it affects then how we behave. However, there's another side to that. With functionalism, they were really interested in looking at how the mind allows us to adapt. So they were really taking an evolutionary stance on looking at consciousness and the mind-body connection. And so they were really, it's just that, this whole focus on adaptation. And so for James, you know, they thought, well, consciousness, that's the driving force of how we are alive, how we perceive that we are alive and everything around us. And so, you know, how then did our just physicality, how did our behaviors kind of evolve and adapt to you know, to reflect that level of consciousness. And you know, it comes back to, you know, how does our consciousness have that control over our body that it does? Because a lot of control our mind has over our body is autonomous, right? Meaning that we're not really aware of it. Like right now, you know, talking and moving your mouth, and I'm breathing and my heart's beating, and my mind's not, hey, you gotta breathe, hey, make sure your heart's beat. That's kind of all in the back, where it's like automatically, our brains automatically do that kind of stuff for us, right? And so James was interested in, you know, how that process worked, and how that process came about. And functionalism, like I said, since it kind of took that evolutionary spin on things, this is about when Darwin came out with his theory of evolution. And so, you know, William James and a lot of the other people he hung out with, they were really interested in those ideas. And so he was kind of always interested, William James that is, in philosophy and psychology. And so, you know, these were his own, he was constantly trying to adapt theories related to those fields, is what I'm saying to say, related to those ideas of defining consciousness. Alright, so like we said, he's the father of American psychology. Just to kind of relate it back to our little prehistory video there, as when I was talking about how the early works of psychology, you know, they were influenced by Western philosophy, people like the ancient Greeks, Western Christianity, and they were also influenced by other cultures that they interacted and traveled and read about, or and in Middle Eastern and Far Eastern philosophy. So William James is a really good example of that. Carl Jung would probably be the next great example of that. But William James, he was a really educated and well-traveled and well-versed young man for his time, and it was because he was kind of the affluent society, so he had the luxury to be able to travel and get all this education that he did, and good thing for it, because you know, he was willing to share all of that information, and we've learned a lot from him. In fact, one of the definitive psychology books of all time, even today, is still his Principles of Psychology. And there's just a few more fun facts there about William James and his brother Henry James. Henry James, he wrote The Golden Bough, B-O-U-G-H. Pretty sure Henry James wrote that. I know he wrote a lot of little short stories. One was called The Americans. It's pretty funny if you've never read it. And just little things like that. So he was kind of famous at the time too. And then just briefly then listing James' main contributions to psychology. So that idea that consciousness is a stream, looking at that evolutionary perspective, so looking at things like adaptation, these natural kind of innate feelings and behaviors that we have, you know, like where do they come from, what do they relate to, how do they relate to that mind-body connection, and then based on that he came up with that complex theory of the self, theory of emotion, because remember, kind of before all of this we were stuck with Plato and Aristotle, so it was either you were ran by the heart, or which is Aristotle, or Plato, you were ran by the head. So you know, there wasn't that connecting everything. And so James was one of the first ones to come up and be like, wait a minute, it's not an either or thing, because humans are more complicated than that. And then not only that, we have this thing called emotions, and to truly understand consciousness, we have to look at that aspect of being human too. And then finally, James was really the first to really open psychology to include kind of more of those religious beliefs and kind of just mystical type teaching. Hence why when psychology started in America, it was kind of mysticism. It was kind of all about, looking for it was about a big interest in the afterlife, because once again it came back to this idea of consciousness. Well, what is it and what happens to it when we die? And so many other cultures believe that there's life after death. Even in Christianity, they believe there is life after death. And so so mysticism was really just kind of this newfound way of looking into spirituality, and it was also a way of realizing that there's such a thing as spiritual reality, that someone doesn't have to subscribe to a religious tradition or religious dogma, but they can be like have these spiritual type feelings and create these connections with other beings and other realms of existence. So that is basically all that I want to share now about James. There's just a few more things there on that slide that I definitely invite you to read. Alright, and then so what we see with functionalism is that James, he did have other psychologists that went out and furthered his ideas. Angel is a really good example of that, and he took functionalism to the point of looking at that mind-body connection and saying that, the mind helped the body survive, so, because of what's going on in our head. And that then is how we are able to react and adapt to the environment around us. So consciousness is like a survival mechanism. But Angel got a lot of criticism for his work, but it's really important because, once again, looking then about, it kind of then goes back to that nature versus nurture debate there, because we're looking at how the environment influences who we are and how we behave as human beings. And then just because of functionalism, and then Darwin coming out with his theory, his Origins of Species, that was actually the name of the book, we see that there's just more interest in the scientific world. We see more people coming out doing research on defining consciousness. John Dewey is one of them. And here's another one of our fathers of something. So John Dewey is pretty much the father of pragmatism. And pragmatism it's just that. It's being pragmatic or practical. So in many ways, functionalism was trying to be practical by looking at those adaptive qualities of the mind and how that influenced us. But with Dewey, he was really looking at the very practical, no-nonsense aspect of it. And so for Dewey then, for that pragmatic kind of practical theory, that was based on more of a natural view. So just, looking at, once again, we're talking about in relation to behavior in relationship to our environment. So it's just, observing how people naturally behave, and then, combining that with those empiricism, which is just a practical, evidence, proof, and then, phrasing more perennial philosophical questions. And so what he means by perennial is kind of like with flowers. You have flowers that are perennial, annuals. Annuals come up every year. Perennial are kind of they just have a specific period of growth every year. And so that's why it's kind of like, let's look at this from a more practical perspective and try to find more of kind of like let's try to handle it in chunks, I guess is a way to say, for specific time periods or something like that. And then where Dewey actually kind of was a little different from functionalism too, is that he then added in our experiences. So it's just not that we just evolved this way, so it's all in our DNA and that's how we're going to turn out regardless. Dewey, being the practical guy that he was, said, no, it's probably more our behavior, and that mind-body connection is related to our experiences, meaning that there's a connection between how you think and behave and the type of environment you grow up in. And we know that's kind of true for some things about behaviors. And just one last note on Dewey. Dewey's also famous in the world of education. Much of the paradigms, so when it comes to education, and especially more student-centered education, kind of started with John Dewey, because he was looking at how our behavior is affected by our environment. He applied that then to the educational setting. So how then do we take that information and be able to provide education to all people and tailor it so that it is based on their environments and their experiences? And that sounds great, because what Dewey was trying to do was open education up to more people, because remember back in the day it was kind of limited to just affluent society, and that affluent society just happened to be mostly young white males. So Dewey was interested in figuring out how to get more people education, and doing that in a way, like I said, that it would be kind of tailored to them. And that was great, but that did lead to some kind of studies in eugenics and even in just psychology and intelligence that kind of equated environment to intelligence. So things like people's race, people's ethnicities, they were kind of viewed as having lower intelligence, and a lot of it just had to do because of these different social and natural environments that people lived in. And it also has to do with the bias of the intelligence test, because what did I just say? The majority of the education system was set up to affluent young white men, so that means that all the tests and experiments they initially did were all done on these affluent young white men, and so they were getting this data that was only reflective of that group, and saying that it was reflective of everybody, because psychology was not very multicultural at this time. And so a lot of those early intelligence tests, were really biased and despairing if you were not in that group. So, many people of color have been labeled as below intelligence or subpar intelligence or mentally retarded, because that is what we officially call that. It's not a derogatory term like it's been popularly turned into. Mentally retarded in psychology simply means that someone has a IQ that is below 72, 70. It starts somewhere in the 70s there. And once again, it goes back to kind of these biases and intelligence tests. And we kind of see some of that in the education system too, because sometimes those tests they have to do at the end of the year, they're not taking into account the differences in those socioeconomic conditions. They're not, here's what I say, they don't take multiculturalism into account, and they're still basing these ideas of academia on the secondary level and intelligence, to kind of outdated data. So that's why you see a lot of problems in the education system as far as funding, that because it does relate to fundings and just curriculum. Alright, so both structuralism and functionalism, they were our first schools of thought there in psychology, and they were really crucial in helping psychology, kind of stand up and then get in its own right within the field of science. So just to recap, structuralism helped shape our basic understanding of cognitive processes. Functionalism just helped us lay that foundation for the furthering of understanding of human behavior. Terrible sentence, don't talk like that. And because of these schools of thought, we just see that psychology just continues to grow, and we learn more and more about the mind-body connection. And And then in steps behaviorism. And behaviorism just has to be totally different and say, no, there's no such thing as a mind-body connection when it comes to how people act and how they engage with others. What they are doing is what is important. We don't care what they're thinking. We don't care what they're feeling. All we're interested in how are they acting. So behaviorism is really about observable behavior only. And this is a lot of time how research has been conducted with animals, because we used to think that animals were so subpar to humanity that they didn't have cognitive processes or emotions, and so that's really all you could do. You could just sit back and just look at what they were doing and then come up with your own interpretation of what that means. But we know that that's not true for animals. They do have ways of thinking and feeling, and so we will see that behaviorism kind of has to contend with that. It kind of flips itself on its nose, because it realizes that, wait a minute, you've got to put those mental processes and that emotional connection back into observing behaviors and explaining and understanding behavior. So when it comes to just the type of psychology that we see implemented in the real world, it would be behaviorism, because it's the most concrete. With behaviorism, so it's observing behavior, and it's looking at how behavior, it's observing behavior between it's just how somebody reacts to something, basically. It's like you give them a stimuli, which would be something, right? So you give them a stimuli, and then you look to see how they react to it. So, that's it. That's behaviorism. Introduce the stimuli, wait for the response. And so since they realize that there are certain stimuli that you can introduce, that different stimuli institute different responses, right? So that's when they got the idea, well, if we can, introduce a stimuli and that changes their response, then we have a better way of understanding how to control behavior, okay? So behaviorism actually started with Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist, and he did this experiment with some dogs in which he taught the dogs to salivate to a sound of a bell. So real briefly, we do get into all these theories more in depth as we go along in class, and just with this video I just want to give you guys just those brief, just a brief little nutshell of what everything is. So once we get into class and our discussions, and you hear these words and these people's names start coming up, you're going to be like, it'll ring a bell. No pun intended there, but that's pretty much what Pavlov did with his dogs. But it's just, this is all just condensed. So what Pavlov did with these dogs is he realized that when it was time to eat and the dogs saw the food, they would start to salivate. And so he thought, well, if the dogs salivate when they see their food, maybe it's a natural reaction, right? That's what they naturally do. And so Pavlov got the idea that, well, if they naturally do that to, their food, I can teach them to slobber to something else. And so classical conditioning is born. And classical conditioning is just that. It's a way to control and modify behavior based on those automatic processes. Now, for dogs, their brain's not going, hey, there's food, slobber. It's what I was talking about, like with us. Our brain's not telling us, hey, your heart needs to beat, or hey, your heart's not beating, beat, or hey, breathe, don't breathe. Those are all these automatic processes that our brain our brains do for us. And so what Pavlov discovered was that you can train those automatic responses and sometimes you can do it without people even realizing it, because we do that a lot in society. A lot of our society, especially media, advertisements, social settings, they're really based on these behavioralist ideas. So what Pablo did is he found a new stimulus to make those dogs respond to make them salivate to, okay? So we take a bell, ring the bell, introduce the food, ring the bell, introduce the food, dog salivates, right? Ring the bell, dog salivates. It's like after you do that, it's a successful approximation, meaning it's steps and stages, because you got to keep introducing it. You know, you have to make that connection of what's going on there. And so, you know, finally the dogs made that connection, and it got to the point to where they would just hear the researchers walking down the hall, or the researchers would open the door and the dogs would start salivating, because they knew the anticipation of they were going to get fed. And I'm like, that's not, you know, Pablo went through a lot of trouble there, because I'm sure, you know, my dogs know once they hear us pull up outside that something good is coming their way. You know what I mean? If he had been nicer to his dogs, they probably would have already known to start salivating before he got there. Alright, that's on my own tangent. Sorry about that, guys. So anyway, so this is what we learned from it. Once again, classical conditioning. We learned that our automatic responses can be controlled and modified, and it's all based on that reaction to a stimuli. So how you respond to a stimuli. Alright. So next comes in John B. Watson, and John B. Watson comes along, and he believed, you know, we go back to the nature versus nurture debate here, and so Watson believed that everybody was born blank slates, and that our behavior was a result of our environmental influence. So Watson believed that he could take any baby that was just born, and he could teach it to be a bank robber, he could teach it to be a serial killer, he could teach it to be a Buddhist monk, he could teach it to be a, you know, NASA scientist. He just thought that we were such blank slates that all you had to do was just condition any human being, and you can make them be whoever you wanted. They would be whatever you wanted. So it doesn't quite work that way, because, you know, we do have these kind of individual idiosyncrasies and personalities that make us different, and so, you know, we're not always all going to react the same. So Watson, though, is really famous for an experiment he did called, we call it the Little Albert experiment, and he basically conditioned this baby to learn to be scared of a white rat, and he did it by like making a loud noise. So he would bang something and make this really loud noise until just you know, even before the little baby would see that rat, he would start to cry, and it had to do with phobias. He wanted to prove that phobias were learned, and they weren't something that is innate inside of you, and that's not necessarily true either, or it was not something innate inside of you. Yeah, so that's not, you know, phobias can be learned, but then there's we also think that it has something to do with DNA. In some cases, you know, that's the thing about psychology, is that it's not necessarily making generalizations, but it's just realizing that we know that certain things, but we don't know everything. So all right. So next we have Edward Thorndike, who comes up with operant conditioning, and he was over in Europe. And then over here in America we had I think B.F. Skinner was America. You might have to scratch that. He might have been in Britain. I was trying to think of his experiment he did with his pigeons during World War II. I can't remember if he was in America or Britain. Anyway, B.F. Skinner comes along, and so Thorndike starts operant conditioning. And so basically classical conditioning, we know that we can control and modify behavior based on these automatic responses. And so Thorndike kind of came up with, well, what about the other side of human behavior? What about the unautomated processes? What about our free will and motivation and just the person choosing to either behave that way or not? You know, how do we get people to behave a certain way is pretty much what he was saying, you know, since Pavlov did his with animals to show that they could be trained. And Thorndike, well, how do we do this with human beings? And so we come up with this idea of reinforcement, and it's called operant conditioning, but it's really B.F. Skinner that made it famous. And Skinner, basically the education system, the penal system, they're steeped in operant conditioning kind of a ideology. So operant conditioning is a system of punishments and rewards. So it's you get, you know, you present a stimulus, you get a desired response, and then you present a reward, or you know, you present that stimulus, you don't get the response, and then what do? You get a punishment. But this idea of reinforcement, because it's kind of motivation, is what operant conditioning is based on. You know, it's like when we don't have these automatic processes, how do we motivate people to behave a certain way? So once again, you know, we see that in education, the penal system, and the world of advertising and media. They all play a lot, really play on that systems of rewards and punishments. And it was actually John BWatson. He was kind of kicked out of the world of psychology because he had an affair with his married assistant. She, of course, was married to somebody else. So we got, and even with all the crazy ideas and experiments he did, it was him having an affair with this lady, and I'm so sorry I forget her name. No, I can't remember her name at all. But he got kicked out, and he went into the world of advertisement. And so that's why a lot of, you may hear about subliminal messages and advertisement, and just that, the way that they make their advertisements to motivate us for that reward of something pleasurable, right? That's all based on operant conditioning and these ideas of how you can modify and control behavior. But Watson kind of started all of that. He kind of, because he went into the field of advertisement, and that's when it really just exploded. Alright, and here I'll just give you guys a couple minutes here. In fact, I need to get some water. But I've got some slides here, and I just pretty much summarized all these theorists for you guys. But I'll just give you a couple minutes so that you can read over them. Let me grab some water real quick. Like I said, try to kind of keep this a little concise so we don't take up too much time. And then, like I said, we will definitely come back to all these guys later. I was just thinking it was, I can't remember her first name. Susan Rainier? No, Susan was the lady. She did another. But his assistant there, Rainer, whatever her first name is, she might have been the one he had an affair with. I don't know, but it was Susan Jones, where you see. So that's important to know about Watson too, is that, so we did that experiment to show that phobias were learned, and then a very controversial experiment, as we will see later in class. But then Susan Jones comes along and she counter conditions. So she shows that if phobias can be learned, they can also be unlearned. Alright, and then here's just with Pavlov and Skinner. And like I said, Pavlov was the one, he's real famous for the dog, you know, ring the bell, dog salivates. And so he came up with classical conditioning. I think it might be next week when we're looking at, no, it's in a few weeks here. Next week we'll look at the brain, and then we'll really get into these ideas of classical conditioner. I think it's week 3 or week 4. I pretty much have everything I say there is pretty much what I was telling you guys. But like I said, just all summed up on some slides. So in case you guys want to read over those, get a little more in depth, a little more concise. Alright, so from behaviorism then, our next school of thought, our main school of thought, because in between behavior, because functionalism, structuralism, they were, functionalism was a response to structuralism. Gestalt psychology, that we'll see here in a few slides, was kind of a response to both of them. And so this isn't really going over these main school of thoughts. It's a little bit kind of timeline, but then I also have some that are thrown in, as where you see, because it's kind of always been a field that's an integrative in the fact, or not integrative, but dynamic in the fact that dynamic and kind of intricate, that's what I was trying to say, and the fact that it's got all these different branches, and that any one time in the history here there was somebody else coming up with another idea about something. It's just these main ones are just that. These are like the most accepted, most popular, and then like I said, some of the ones that are popular even out in the non-science sphere. And that brings us to Freud and Freud and psychoanalysis. And Freud is probably the most celebrated, influential, and controversial psychologist of all time. He is the father of psychoanalysis. And whenever we see psychology portrayed in popular media, it is psychoanalysis that they are talking about. So you go to the psychologist, and what do? You walk in the office, you lay down on the bed, and the psychologist says, "Tell me how you feel," and you just start talking, and he listens. That's of course, psychoanalysis is not that simplistic, but that is psychoanalysis in a nutshell. And Freud came up with this, and it really began during the Victorian era. Freud was alive during both world wars. In fact, during World War II, he was in Vienna, or he was at least in Austria, and he had to leave because the Nazis were invading. And there's a lot of there are many ideas in psychology that we still use based off of him. I've given you guys time to read the slide here while I kind of talk. And probably one of the biggest, most influential things that Freud brought to psychology was breaking the mind up into 3 different parts. So he says that we have our conscious mind, our subconscious mind, and our unconscious mind. And so Freud basically thought that, once again, we had these 3 structures to the mind. Now, these weren't physical structures. These were just they're concepts of how our mind works, and then how that influences our behavior. And so Freud believed that basically all of our behavior, thoughts, emotions, everything you could think of that makes us human is down in our unconscious mind. That was the biggest part, and it's really the part that is least explored, and one that we're least aware of. And so it manifests us through these motivations of the eros and the thanatos, which are our sex and our aggression drive. So a lot of Freud's theory is really based on this idea of libido, and then just a suppression of sexual energy. And Freud was a little obsessed with just sex in general, and thought that to be a main motivator for much of human history, or explaining abnormal personalities and neuroses like that, and things of that nature. But Freud's probably right on some of the things he has to say about people. Like I said, we'll get into it more later on, but I just want us to note that, he came up with those 3 structures of the mind. This idea of deep listening, to where, or he called it evenly suspended attention, and that is when somebody comes in and they're looking for help, for therapy, that even though you're the therapist and you have all the education and the knowledge, your job is just to listen, because most of the time, just by people being able to talk it out, And that really helps get to that root cause, that root understanding of what is bothering somebody. And so that's why I say his structures of the mind, we actually say that the mind is like an iceberg. And so that's what he said. So the conscious is the tiny little part. Subconscious is kind of still right there at the top, not, kind of at the top on the surface of the water. And then like an iceberg, the biggest part is underneath. So that would be the unconscious. And then from Freud we get the ideas of the ego and the id and the super ego. So you guys should probably know those. Like I said, those are all pretty popular terms as far as just media goes. So movies, books, cartoons, you name it, you will find Freudian elements in it. And then just as a little wrap up on Freud there, so some of those insights that he gave us for psychology. Alright, and so because Freud was like, everything, your behavior was all based on something that traumatic that happened in your childhood, and a lot of it goes back to these unrealized sexual feelings that you have, usually for your paternal figure, your parent. And because not all of Freud's students really dug that. They were like, okay, maybe that's for some people, but I definitely know that I don't have unresolved traumatic childhood experiences that is causing this thought or this behavior. So what we see is a part from Freud, and his daughter was one of those psychoanalysis that kind of became a neo-Freudian, we say, because they kind of changed. They held the main essence of psychoanalysis, kind of those main contributions, but that all of Freud's interested on those the sexual and aggression drive, and these ideas about libido and unresolved childhood trauma. A lot of them moved away from that. So Adler is another one. Carl Jung, of course, is the most famous neo-Freudian. And then just some of those assumptions that we have in psychoanalysis. Like I said, Freud and even the neo-Freudians, they believe that unconscious motivations dictate a lot of our thoughts and actions and even emotions. They do believe that psychological problems that are always rooted in our childhood experiences. Now the difference here is, once again, it's that, see, for Freud it was specifically something traumatic that happened, and for the neo-Freudians, which we now psychodynamic theory instead of psychoanalysis, we say psychodynamic because we note that changing nature, right? So they still thought that something in your childhood is kind of like, it does, behavior starts young, and what you experience then does have an effect on you. They all believe that the personality is made up of the id, the ego, and the super ego. And then, like I said, we have those, the eros and the thanatos. And so that then is just a brief overview on psychoanalysis. So really looking at those unconscious processes and how those affects our thoughts, emotions, and actions there. And then about the 1950s, we have the humanists come along. So Freud, there, especially in his old age, after living through the world wars, he became a little pessimistic about human behavior, which is another reason why they kind of, split from him. And so in response to that, we see humanism coming about. And so with humanism, free will and the human potential for growth are emphasized. So in the past there we see how it was all about, it was mostly about behavior was determined. Behavior was either determined by those mental processes, it was determined by evolutionary adaptation, it was determined by whatever stimulus you had presented to you, and a lot of it just wasn't taking into account individuality and individual responses. And so that's where humanism comes in. And so humanism, it was developed by Maslow, and then Carl Rogers is another big humanist. And so basically with Maslow, he was saying that all humans are have the potential for love and have the potential to just be whatever they want to be, and when they're in an environment where they feel cared for, they have their needs met, then their potential to actualize and use their gifts, it becomes more prominent. Okay, so this idea of self-actualizing, of everybody being the best human being that they can be, and that's really the main focus there. So really the difference, if you get down to therapy, is that humanists, they don't look at anything from the past and somebody's records. They approach everybody as kind of a here and now, and they don't want any preconceived notions of their patients, and and it is more of a talking and encouraging, and then actually getting that person to kind of go out and act and see and do things too. Okay. So it was a little different from psychoanalysis, whereas like you said, you just kind of write or talk about what's bothering you. They kind of they will do more interactive things, and so this led to more holistic, creative, or holistic, integrative types of psychology. And so, like I said, Maslow's, he came up with these whole ideas of self-actualization, and that everybody has this potential and can be whatever they want, and so he was really looking about how we motivate people to do that. And so, of course, we go back to operant conditioning a little, because we see that rewards are a part of our motivation, and those rewards can be unconscious desires. And so, once again, humanism came about because people thought that Freud was a little too negative at the time, and in the past they'd been a little bit too negative about explaining human behavior. So Maslow's was kind of looking more to the positive side of it. And then, like I said, this idea about having needs met influencing your behavior. And so basically Maslow came up with this idea of a pyramid, and self-actualization is about us moving towards our growth, being the best human beings that we can. And so he arranges everything into a pyramid like this. So you have to have those basic needs met. Let me move my box here. So we have to have those basic needs, those basic physiological needs met at the beginning before we can ever reach any of those other steps on the pyramid. Because if you're too busy worrying about food, water, and where you're going to sleep that night, then how are you ever going to focus on problem solving, being creative, or think about morality? So Maslow was saying is that, as we have these needs met, it helps us reach more of those self-actualized level. And self-actualization, even though this is a pyramid, self-actualization is not a done process. Like, once you get to that step, you still keep learning and growing. All right. So then we have Carl Rogers come in, and he added to this and so he added to Maslow's ideas by saying that in order to have those needs met, people also need to have a positive and productive environment. And a lot of that came from healthy childhood development. And so Rogers was also instrumental in realizing our ideas of self, about how we all have these different ways of how we view ourself. And so for us to self-actualize, we need to have all those different ideas of self in congruence, which means they have to be balanced. And so once we're able to balance all of that out, then we could be those fully functioning members of society. And so in the 1950s, we really see a lot of different schools of thoughts come about that were either rejecting or reinforcing psychoanalysis. Once again, we see behaviorism kind of playing a role. Oh, and let me add to that. So then behaviorism, like I said, it kind of turns on its head because it's about observing behaviors only, right, guys? Well, once we start getting into Skinner and that idea of a system of rewards and punishment, what do we see? We're going back to thoughts and emotions. You know, you just can't present somebody with a stimuli and expect them to change their behavior without some kind of rationale or some kind of explanation to it, right? Think about when you punish your child, you know, what's that? Well, why? Who says? Why? Right? Kids naturally do that. And that's where, you know, they start, because we start to see that, okay, wait a minute. Maybe it doesn't matter how much you put something, you know, you dangle that carrot in front of the little human's nose, they're not going to get it until they're kind of in congruence with their thoughts and emotions. It's like, you know, to get that reward and find it motivating, you have to consider the mental and emotional aspects of it too. So alright though, so that wraps up our first main schools of thought, and in video 3 we will go over our last little bit that will kind of bring us up to date and current on the schools of thoughts in psychology. Okay, thanks, bye.